vibrant and busy part of Birmingham city centre, tucked away between all the restaurants and bars, there's a real historical gem. Now, it's not just a poignant reminder of this city's past, but of the country's heritage as a whole. Now, at first glance, this might look like any other ordinary sort of set of terraced houses, but it's not. In fact, this is incredibly rare because it's the last remaining example of a style of living which has more or less been forgotten about. Yet at one point in our history, most people that lived and worked in industrial towns and cities in England lived in accommodation like this, the back-to-back.
Now, I know what you're thinking, but our understanding of the term back-to-back has changed over the years. It's now applied to Coronation Street style houses, but it actually refers to something very specific. These houses weren't just attached to their neighbours on either side. The back walls were also shared. One house was built literally onto the back of another. They sprung up in their tens of thousands at the end of the 18th and throughout the 19th century.
They were as much a part of the Industrial Revolution as anything that was manufactured in the factories and workshops, and when thousands of people flocked to the towns and cities looking for work, property speculators saw an opportunity and a building frenzy began. By 1850, 2/3 of Birmingham's population lived in courts just like this one.
Today, this is all that remains of this once common type of housing. It was fully restored by the Birmingham Conservation Trust and the National Trust back in 2000. Chris Upton was the historian involved with the project.
So is this typical of most back-to-back courts?
Yeah, sure. They're clustered around a yard.
Yeah.
There's one entrance and one exit, which could be tricky in a fire.
Yeah.
They're real fire hazards. And there's 11 houses here. Some of them had half a dozen, some of them 20, 30 houses. Right. Depending on the plot of land the developer had, how many houses he could squeeze in on it. And there'd be another court next door and another one beyond that. They weren't everywhere. You don't find them in London. You didn't find them in the northeast. It's that middle bit of the country. Manchester, Liverpool, Hull, Leeds, down to Birmingham was back-to-back living. It's tenements if you get further north and further south.
What would it have been like in its day?
It was described as living at the bottom of a well sometimes because not much light gets in.
No, and if there was light, it'd be full of smog up there probably.
Well, that's right.
In industrial England.
Yeah, yeah.
In this particular court, how many people lived?
At most, 65 is the highest I've found.
But obviously there's no loos inside, so there's only 3 outside loos for 60-odd people.
Yeah, they could be death traps because the water supply and the toilets are worryingly close to each other.
Sure.
And, so people did pick things up, and once an epidemic got into a court,
it was
or something, it ran round fast. So they were thought of as very unhealthy places, even though the people enjoyed living in them.
Can we go inside and have a look?
Yeah, sure. This way.
Hey, do you know what? It feels like we've landed right in the middle of the Victorian era.
And we have, in about 1870.
So how many people would have lived in this particular house then?
Well, this was the home of the Oldfield family, and there was Mr. and Mrs. Oldfield and their 8 children.
Wow.
And a lodger, and the lodger's girlfriend with 2 bedrooms.
That's a lot of people. I was just going to say it, but it's only 2 bedrooms.
Yeah.
Where did most of the people come from to rent these places?
All over the country and abroad. So there was a Jewish community, there were quite a few Italians, there were a lot of Irish, Scots, but the majority are from the surrounding countryside.
Coming in wanting to work in the factories.
Yep.
People were lured to the towns by better wages and guaranteed work, but the effect on their health was undeniable.
So what was the average life expectancy?
It's difficult to answer that, Paul, but it depends very much which street you lived in,
right,
and which area you lived in. If you lived in what we'd now call the suburbs of Birmingham, you know, only a mile or 2 out, your life expectancy was double what it would be right in the centre. There were streets in central Birmingham where half the children would die before the age of 5.
National legislation had banned the building of new courts way back in 1870, and local authorities were encouraged to demolish them. For cities like Birmingham, it would prove a monumental challenge. By the end of the First World War, the city still had more than 43,000 back-to-backs. In fact, some people still lived in them right up to the 1970s, a whole 100 years after the ban.
Why did it take such a long time to knock them all down then?
Just the sheer number of them. I mean, there were 10,000 courts, so you couldn't put that many people onto the housing market at the same time.
You couldn't rehouse them. Well, thank goodness this one survived. What was it about this one?
Really, I think it was accident. It's mostly a commercial street, Her Street, and I think eventually people forgot what they were.
Have you actually chatted to people that lived here? What did they say?
It's very different. If you had a happy family life, you liked the back-to-backs. If you had an unhappy family life, you didn't.
So if the last tenants moved out in the 1960s, you would have known them and spoken to them?
Yes, interviewed them. Yeah.
And what were their recollections of the place then?
They leave with excitement and then very quickly realise that they've lost something in the process. They've lost that sense of community, of knowing your neighbours. So it was a trade-off. But the last couple to move out said it was like a little palace to us.
Gosh, that's like stepping back in time. Thank goodness this court has survived demolition, because without it, a very important part of our social history would have disappeared, along with the bricks and mortar. And thankfully, it now remains a living testament to how thousands of people would have lived in industrial towns and cities all over the country. And it's just as valuable to our heritage as those big stately homes.